Hi guys, welcome to the Energy, Climate, and Environmental Impacts panel. My name is Megan Fuchs, and I'm going to be moderating. And these are our panelists. If you could all introduce yourselves.
I'm Dr. Trevor Browning. I'm professor of environmental science here at the college.
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Baghdadi. I'm a sustainability and environmental analyst at Corning.
I am Dr. Michael Selig, and I'm a chemistry professor here at Elmira College.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lynn Gillie, and I'm a biology professor here at Elmira.
And just a reminder, there is a sign-in sheet over by the piano, so make sure you sign in for that.
Great. Do you want us to pass a timer down?
Yeah,
that work?
I can do that.
I can do it on mine.
Okay.
Sorry. Who wants to start? Lynn, you want to start us off? Sure.
Why not?
Here, I'll give you. There's a little timer.
Minutes.
Clock's on. Perfect, clock's on. So I come to this from the perspective of a biologist, and this session is about energy, right? So when I think energy, I'm thinking about the energy pyramid and ecosystems ecology. And then comparing that to the energy usage that we have in the US. So in our energy pyramid, right, you have a base and you're working your way up toward the peak. You're looking at trophic levels, and all that input is coming in from the sun. And then as you, second law of thermodynamics, as you change form of that energy, working your way up through the pyramid, you lose efficiency at each step, right? So you're only getting about 10% efficiency as you work your way up. So efficiencies are things that I think are important to talk about when you talk about energy. And our traditional forms of energy have certain efficiencies associated with them. And some of the new renewable energies have efficiencies associated with them. So we can talk about efficiency as one measure of how we're doing. I think that for many of these things, we have to look at the trade-offs, right? There are positives and negatives to everything. And when I look at the impact on the environment, as an animal behaviorist and an ecologist, I'm looking at that impact on the animals and the plants and the environment. And even the most renewable green energy is going to have some impact on animals and on plants and on microbes. And so I think that we need to look at strategies to mitigate that impact. And if we look at all the things involved with energy, so there's just exploration to find new ways of getting energy. There's extraction if you're looking at something like fossil fuels. There's the manufacture, the creation of something like solar panels. There's refining that. There's transporting it, and then there's storage. And all of those things have different impacts. So something that might be just fine for whale migration in terms of energy creation or storage might really impact them in terms of transport. You're transporting the energy, you might be disrupting their migration patterns, things like that. So I think that it's important to look at which aspect of energy is impacting the environment and how it's impacting, so that you can have a strategy in place to mitigate it where you need to. And there are some interesting ways to look at sensitivity, exposure, risks, and target the most vulnerable populations. Some animals and plant populations and habitats bounce back from disturbance, and others don't bounce back and are not as resilient. So I'm happy to talk about any of those sorts of things.
You kicking the can to me?
I'm gonna kick the can.
All right. So I guess I'm coming to this panel, this session from a background, a kind of diverse background, which started with some engineering degrees in environmental and bioengineering a long time ago. I was fortunate enough to get my first big job was at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory out in Golden, Colorado. I worked there as a staff scientist for 6 years, doing mostly second generation biofuel research. So does anyone know the difference between second generation and first generation biofuels? Or resources, bioresources, right? And so first generation, when you talk about biofuels, would be things like production of ethanol from cornstarch, right? And so the primary, sugar sources like starches, which often extract from food resources and affect a lot of things in that way. And so it's kind of thought to be more of a waste of a resource than anything. Second generation is harvesting sugars from plant-based, plant cell wall-based resources. So cellulose-based, hemicellulose-based, things that make up the strengthening walls of plants, which is a huge, one of the more abundant resources in the world. So that's where my background came from, more of the engineering side, but bioprocessing side of those materials, convert them to sugars to be fermented to make fuels or other materials, right, or chemicals. On the energy side, I have a chemistry background. I teach chemistry now. I've taught physics in the past as well, and so I really that understanding of what it takes to produce energy, what resources are out there, and we have a diverse range of resources available to us. And particularly, it depends on where we are. In New York State, that's primarily hydropower from Niagara Falls. But we also have a mix in the state from wind to solar to a few nuclear power plants. And so discussing the diversity of options that we have out there, also the context of outside of energy with respect to electricity production, energy we use to move things, fuel energy in the context of petroleum fuels, they're downsides as well as the upsides, and alternate resources that we can use to power things from biofuels, and then extrapolating out into the context of biomaterials and materials that are renewable in general. I think that I'd be open for discussion on a lot of those things. The one extra thing that I think is a priority in the context of all efforts with respect to energy and materials is the impact it has on society. Beyond, the environmental impacts are huge, and there are good sides to all technologies and there are downsides to all technologies, but you also have to consider the impacts it has on the weakest populations in any society. And so a lot of things out there that are encouraged are good, and policies that are made by governments need to balance the good with the impacts they have on the poor and populations that cannot necessarily afford to give up the cheapest options we have out there. And so it's when I'll pass the can or kick the can down the road and then I'll end there.
Do you know how to?
I have no idea. There you
We
go.
got it.
I don't know how to use it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm coming to this panel. It's my first panel, actually, so please be easy on me. My background is environmental biology. I went to school in Syracuse at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, but even before that, I was interested in conservation from a young age. I wanted to be a conservation biologist, helping cheetahs actually escape extinction. And then I got to school and I learned that, climate change is such a huge issue we need to tackle. There are so many complexities, as everyone was mentioning. And I realized I wanted to study something a bit broader because I still didn't know how I wanted to combat the problem or what my role was in this whole, issue of climate change. And so I ended up changing my major to environmental biology from conservation biology. And also growing up, I was lucky enough to be a third culture kid. So my mom worked for the State Department and we got to live in different countries. And so I saw like wind turbines in Cyprus and rainforests in Brazil. And I lived in India for a while and saw solar panels out in these like remote villages. And I was like, wow, this is so inspiring. But also I saw the negative sides of climate change and pollution, especially we lived in New Delhi, which is the capital of India, and they have a lot of air pollution there in the wintertime. So we were wearing masks, and there was a lot of waste and overpopulation there. So from all that, I have just been over time, my whole life, kind of moving towards, I want to make an impact. I want to help the environment. I want to help animals. So I have also that biology piece. And then after graduating, I graduated during COVID. So it was kind of an uncertain time, but I was able to do some research right out of school at Cornell, something biology related. And then from there, I learned of an opportunity at Corning, which is a really wonderful organization here in upstate New York, not too far away. You probably all know about Corning. And so I'm in their global energy management group, and we work on minimizing resources that the company uses. So whether that's energy efficiency, reducing waste, conserving water, my particular practice area is helping to purchase renewable energy. And so when you buy renewables, it can help you reduce your greenhouse gas emissions related to electricity. And so that's been my role, is kind of helping Corning negotiate contracts that we can buy solar energy from a certain solar array. And even further than that, we will agree to buy that solar power for 15 to 20 years. So a very long-term agreement. And the solar developers can go and take that contract and say, hey, I've got, this investment grade company willing to buy my power. Can I build my solar array now? So we actually agree to buy the power in order to help the array get built. So that's something I'm very involved in. And we also have just recently at Corning committed to the Science Based Targets Initiative and released public goals about how we're going to reduce our emissions by 2028. So I encourage you to look up Corning's website, or we just recently released our sustainability report for 2022. You can read all about it there. But basically, I'm helping the company with, first, you measure your greenhouse gas emissions to figure out, okay, what do we need to reduce? Where are we now? And then you model out and say, okay, by 2028, with all of our growth, where will our emissions be? And then you have to kind of make a roadmap on the way there and say, all right, first, I'm going to make my facilities as energy efficient as possible. And so that means that you reduce the amount of energy you need to buy in the first place. And then after that, you say, okay, where am I using natural gas and fossil fuels? And can I convert that to electricity where feasible? And so once you do that, you are kind of shifting your emissions from gas-based to electricity-based. And we have a solution for electricity-based emissions, it's renewables. And so once you are as electrified as you can be, you then buy renewables equal to how much electricity you're using, and they essentially cancel out your electricity-related emissions in the eyes of the GHG protocol, which is what we abide by. And then after that, there may be some fuels that you weren't able to switch over. You can look at lower carbon content fuel alternatives, and then look at your supply chain. So once you've tackled your own emissions, actually companies are responsible now for their suppliers' emissions and their customers' emissions. So they have to go to their supplier and say, hey, like, I noticed your emissions were very high. Why don't you try buying renewables?
Oh.
So those are the kind of topics I'd like to talk about. Thank you. I used all my time.
You're
There you
good.
go.
Now you know how Trevor wakes up every morning.
No. I wake up by my children every morning. I don't have to use an alarm, which is fine. All right, I'll time myself. So I think all that is great. I mean, that's kind of how I'm approaching these things. As something you were just talking about, which is like, okay, so how do we reduce, right? Because it's all great to have some kind of renewable energy, but scale. This is something we were talking about this morning too. It's like, so something I'm really interested in when it comes to energy is scale, right? If I'm going to go set a solar farm somewhere, what are the impacts of that, right? If I do that for the college, maybe not so big, right? We could probably do that in a pretty reasonable area. If I'm going to do it for the town, that's a lot bigger of an area, right? And where are you going to put such a thing? And what are the minerals required to make those panels, right? So, thinking about diversifying our renewable energy and coming up with unique ways to do it, right? For example, in New York State, we're almost all natural gas and hydroelectric. It's pretty close to a split. We have, you know, developing solar, developing wind. We do still have a trash burning power plant, which is unfortunate. We have no coal burning power plants, which is a good thing. We've done away with that, but we are very reliant on the natural gas. Now, the benefit, and I think Dr. Selig said some of this, is efficiency, right? So there's strong efficiency with a natural gas power plant, which is part of the reason why we use it, right? Whereas the efficiency on solar panels is like at best 25, 30%. Well, that's in the lab, right? 8% in real life, right? Yeah. Yeah. In the lab, you can get up to, we're getting to like, oh, 25%. We're like, yes, this is awesome. And then you take it out into the real world and it's like, well, there's dust, right? And there's cloud cover and there's all sorts of other things that are impacting the type of energy that you get, right? So yeah, I'm interested in exploring other options. One of the things that's really interesting to me, there's a abandoned oil and gas field that's in between here and Corning. And once upon a time, there was thought of trying to develop this into geothermal. And geothermal, what we do is we drill wells really deep into the ground, and then we pump fluid through them. And there's actually, if we go deep enough and we're in the right formations, we can get the conductivity right so that we can actually pump these fluids through the formations and gain heat from them. In fact, Cornell right now is doing their own test geothermal well to try to heat their campus, which is really cool. Ohio State, my alma mater, has wells and a whole field, and that's how they heat a lot of their water. Bunch of water just running underground. Downside to this is, like with anything, it leaks. So whatever you're pumping under the ground is going to leak and maybe get into your water. Similar idea to the negatives of fracking, because there's other nastiness down there that we maybe don't want to come back, right? So my focus, I mean, I focus on a lot of different things, but my background is in geology. So I'm very interested in kind of like, okay, as we go to make a wind farm, does anybody know how many pounds of minerals it takes to make the magnets in the wind farms in one wind turbine? Intro students? Over a ton. Rare earth minerals, which actually, in fact, aren't rare, but the deposits that you can mine them in are. So they're out right here, but you'd have to excavate the whole county to get enough for like a microprocessor, which is not particularly useful, right? So we have these deposits, and there's only a few of them. Ours is famous. It's in California. We famously shut it down and then turned it back on as soon as China hiked the prices up on us after they cornered the market. So, you know, there's these things that we have to think about when we're talking about renewable energy planning for the future, right? So like, we're going to use more energy. We know we are. Well, what plans can we do to reduce our energy? Technologically, we can advance and do very well there, but how can we focus ourselves on reduction as much as possible? So, yeah. Questions?
Questions and discussion time.
Right, thoughts, comments?
Can we ask each other?
Sure. By all means.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Christian.
So you talk about scale and efficiency.
Yep.
I mean, there's probably a financial answer to this, but why would a nuclear source of power not be considered, at least for this area?
That's a good question.
I mean, I can
Yeah,
mention some
go
stuff
for it.
on nuclear. I'm not a nuclear expert, but I mean, in New York State, there are a handful of nuclear power plants. There have not been any new plants built in the US in probably over 40 years now. I think ever since the 3 Mile Island disaster down in southern Pennsylvania, societal pressures, I think, have stalled a lot of that. There are a lot of nuclear power plants within the country, right, that are fully operational today. Most of them are. There aren't many decommissioned plants at this point. Nuclear is definitely an option. There are caveats, there are worries. A lot of the power plants that exist today are near the end of near the end of their life cycle, like, except no one seems to be talking about replacing them or shutting them down. So there are concerns about waste contamination. Of course, you produce a lot of radioactive waste in this process. Those materials, particularly the spent fuel, needs to be stored properly and is going to be radioactive for thousands of years in most cases. So there are those concerns. There are disaster concerns, right? And so no one wants to be the site of the next Chernobyl. And, generally nuclear power plants are safe if operated perfectly and well. And I would guess that a lot of the releases that come from power plants are unknown and underreported. And so I think there's skepticism from the community in that regard. There are, as people work towards newer and newer technologies, there are like newer technologies out there that end up producing less waste. Some of these fast, like I think they're called fast neutron type reactors, where basically everything has more energy in it. The neutrons that are bombarding the materials, which cause the fission. So all nuclear power right now is all fission processes where we're bombarding materials with high energy neutrons, and then they're breaking up the core materials into smaller products. The product process of fission releases a lot of energy. There are many efforts across the globe to do kind of the opposite with fusion technologies, but those are pie in the sky still at this point. There have been some recent breakthroughs where people have succeeded, but I mean, transitioning those efforts into real success and real technology is probably multiple decades away. I think the major concerns are contamination, fears of contamination, true understanding of like the actual environmental impacts sometimes. And I don't know, but it's definitely a possibility. And the newer technologies are more promising, producing less waste, like these faster reactors or the thorium-based reactors are a little safer, smaller scale, and also less waste producing. But in the end, I think the biggest issue with nuclear is the fear component, which is somewhat justified across, but maybe not, maybe a little overzealously felt.
I think part of it too, right? You're talking about environmental contamination.
Yeah.
And really, Dr. Selig's right. It's like there's so much contamination that just goes unreported, right? And so one of our jobs that we're trying to do, things like the Clean Water Act, et cetera, is trying to hold companies and cities, towns, and communities more accountable for what they're putting into their environment, right? And so, yeah, I am certain that there is nuclear waste that's being jettisoned in a way that's probably not so environmentally friendly. However, there's also great regulations that try to prevent those things, and we're getting better on them all the time. The other thing is, like we're saying, the more efficient that we get with the producing less waste, right? We're also people like Corning are developing technologies that can help to store these things for a longer term. Because something that I talk about in geology is all the time, it's like, listen, this stuff came from the earth. It's not like we made it, right? It was already there. What we've done is we've accumulated it all to one spot, which is generally bad. So if we can figure out how to distribute these things back in the way that we found them, or store them so efficiently that they can't get out, which is a problem that we have not even come close to tackling, we'll be a lot better off, right? But I think thinking about, regional power versus right now, we have this huge grid, right, that pumps power all across everywhere, right? And having a nuclear reactor that produces a tremendous amount of power here, do we need that? Right? Maybe not. I don't know. I mean, but I think it should absolutely be in the conversation.
And I believe it is across the globe. I mean, it's
Yeah.
pretty high up.
Yeah, certainly an option.
But I feel like there's a diverse array of opinions in that context, and a pretty broad spectrum of against and for.
Sure. Yeah. What types of energy makes y'all most comfortable? If you had to choose, what would you want where would you want your energy to come from? Hydroelectric.
Is there still like potential to like expand it further, or have we really like maxed it out?
Like in this state or country or?
Yeah, kind of in general, country and state, because we still have Niagara Falls.
Sure.
I'm not sure if we maxed out the potential of that.
I mean, like with anything, there's give and take, right? You could talk to China about that. They've been damming almost every river that they have, right? And actually, don't talk to China. Talk to all of China's border countries that the rivers run into. They're not so happy about it, right? Because when you dam up something, you're reducing the velocity of the flow of water, right? You're also, there's no particulate organic matter, but a severely reduced amount of particulate organic matter, which is what is creating the ecosystem, right? You're stopping up all the sediments. And believe it or not, sediments are important. And they have a role downslope, right? And we need them eventually to get to the downslope riverine communities, to the deltas, and then finally to the ocean. The more that we store those up behind dams, we're impacting the ecosystems, not to mention like the connectivity stuff, right? So there are some issues with hydroelectric in that respect. I certainly there are plenty of places that could have more hydroelectric power, but I think the common thing now in the US is, especially in the West Coast, is to remove them. Because the US has been in a West Coast of the US, it's like in a 15-20 year drought. I mean, it's right, they've been in a drought for a long time now. And all of that water, when you dam up that water, it goes into a big reservoir, right? And then the sun beats down on that reservoir. And instead of it flowing in a small river where it's all moving, it's sitting there, it's getting hot. And what happens? It evaporates, and then you've lost that water to the atmosphere. And it's not gone, but the downslope communities won't see that. So I'd say the more popular choice now is removing those. Here, we have a lot of hydroelectric. We don't have that problem, right? We don't have a water issue. So it impacts us a little less, but the ecosystems are still.
I think with Niagara Falls, it's a bit different too, where there aren't too many waterfalls that are as big as Niagara Falls.
Very true.
In the world. So you have this special resource, which they of course probably could utilize it more because they're only diverting a portion of the water. I mean, it's really a simple potential and a height thing, and they're diverting a portion of that river flow through. But as if you've ever been to Niagara Falls, there's a lot of water flowing over the falls still, and so it's not like the potential to expand that isn't there, although that requires a huge investment in resources and
but it feels
money.
free,
It
right?
feels free
Because it's just water flowing over a waterfall. Just stick a turbine in there, you're good.
but you have to get the turbine in there, right?
Yes.
And you have to have the governments agree to that, and it's on a border. So you have to have two sets of governments agree on that. Granted, that is a huge, I mean, much of Ontario and much of Western New York is the bulk of their energy is supplied by Niagara Falls. And then, there are like natural gas. When you're speaking of natural gas, we do have plants, but I think an abundant portion of that natural gas you're implying is household heating, right? Which is also energy consumption.
Yeah, in our actual plants. I mean, hydro is bigger for us. I think we're 60% hydro, and then I think natural. I mean, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I guess it was closer to
some-
30 or 25% natural gas. It's the second largest component, for sure. But anyway, yeah, good question.
So I'm gonna ask Trevor, I'm gonna ask you a question, is that possible?
Merrick's got a question.
Oh, never mind that.
I know.
No questions.
And farms. That, but I'm from Massachusetts, and off the coast of Massachusetts, where to start to build an offshore wind farm. It's a big piece of space.
Yeah.
I'm worried about their view of the water. Very worried. I just wanted to hear your guys' take on that.
A lot of those habitats are pretty delicate. And assessing that impact is something that we just have to do. So wind farms, there's also, you can generate electricity from tides, right? Tides are nice and predictable and should be able to generate electricity, but if you look to see where some of those are proposed, those are the more shallow ecosystems where a lot of plants and animals and algae and things are going to be living. And they have to live near the shore, right? So that they can get sun energy to do their jobs. And they can't just move to the abyss and do their job over there. They need to live in that near shore environment. And in the intertidal, you have animals and plants that are sessile and can't move away, and they're stuck in place doing their job. And some of the larger animals that can move from spot to spot might depend on those sessile organisms for shelter, for food. And it's hard to say how resilient these plants and animals are going to be. And if we damage them, can they come back? And just, I think a lot of work needs to be done. A lot of research to say, yeah, this is going to be harmful, this is not. And is it worth it? I mean, some people would say,
Yep.
Who cares? I don't care about sea urchins. Bring the wind farms on. And I think part of that's education, research, and seeing what the downstream impact is. We often don't know until we've done something, and then we say, oops, shouldn't have done that. The sea otters are a really nice example of California, right? Beautiful furs, harvest the sea otters. Now the sea urchins have nothing to worry about. So their population explodes. They eat all the kelp. The kelp is gone. All this beautiful kelp forests down to nothing. So you've just essentially made a desert. Now the sea urchins starve because there's no food. So nothing's left. So they leave the sea otters alone, and then everything slowly comes back. They had no idea that sea otters were a keystone species until they removed them. So we probably won't find out until we try it, and then we'll see.
It's almost like every possible source of energy is going to have its caveats, it's going to have its downsides. I mean, and there are upsides, and as much as we try to reduce petroleum-based usage, things that produce carbon dioxide, the reality is that a lot of the other efforts to do other things like wind and solar, and even to some degree hydro, it depends on where you're doing it. A lot of these things are going to require resources too, and require extraction processes that are often large sources of contamination and detrimental to society in different ways. And so I think in all of it, it's a balance between environmental impacts of your efforts to produce energy. It's a balance between what we are going to do for our own human population as well. I think access to abundant, cheap energy is critical for nations to rise out of poverty, right? So there are a lot of nations that are very poor, a lot of parts of the world where people are very poor, and the best way for those regions to rise out of being poor is through cheap, abundant energy. And And as we go forward and consider options and consider regulations, this has to be a paramount thing that is considered, because we can't just say, we can't be the wealthy nation saying, sorry, you don't get to do what we got to do because we messed up. And I think, you know, that's where innovation comes in, and that's where new science and new, you know, people getting involved in science and working towards these things is important. And so when we get to that, in the end, the critical component of it is innovation and research. And sadly, our governments across the board do not really spend much money at all on innovation. And just, you know, working for NREL for the 6 years I was there, our budget was probably in $30 to $40 million a year range, right? And we just spent in the last year $150 billion facilitating a war in Europe. If you imagine spending that much money on science and technology that could benefit the world. And I think that part of the problem is society doesn't have the time or energy to demand from our leaders that we spend more of our resources on things that could actually help everybody out. And so as younger people, I think, you know, not as much maybe in a form of activism, that's always good to kind of stand up, but in like pressuring in every way possible for society to push more investment into things that could actually save, you know, solve a lot of problems is super important. So innovation was big to me, and I think that part of that innovation happening involves the public pushing its leadership to divert more resources to those things rather than typical projects of governments. Thought there.
Anna, where do you see Corning's right as a Fortune 500 big company, right, who's trying to are you pleased with their direction that way? Could you see them doing more? Like, how do you, right? Because I mean, I don't know, a lot of my students say things like, oh, well, it's just me, it's my house, right? Even if I were to take my house off the grid, is that really that big of a deal? What we need is like Dr. Selig says, world leaders or large corporations that are driving that way.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I love about my job is that it's not just me. I'm helping a large corporation to be better and be greener. And I like that they have those values, that they are setting emissions reduction targets and we are disclosing our emissions. And when I was hired on, they also expanded my department to cover more than just energy. And we are now doing waste and water, like I mentioned. So I think we're moving in the right direction. I think there's still a lot to learn, especially related to, you know, as I mentioned, supply chain emissions. So not just your company, which by the way, in Corning is a global company. You know, we operate in many different countries all around the world. So I'm not just looking at, you know, doing solar in New York, which we are doing. We're also looking in Europe and eventually Asia. So it's great that we're able to leverage our resources that we have as a large corporation towards this measure. And also a lot of like the biggest purchasing of renewables is being done by like large tech companies, and they're even more ambitious than the legislation in some places. They are actually like, okay, how can we, you know, integrate environmental justice into this power purchase agreement deal? You know, why don't we take some of the money that the solar farm makes and like reinvest it into the community? So I think there is some very interesting like innovation happening around project finance modeling for renewables. And then, like I said, in Corning, we're just, as we move along, every company is on a journey towards reducing their emissions as much as they can. And also, I think the governments listen to their corporations sometimes. And so if we can use those channels of influence through government and use our power for good, that would be ideal. So I'm pushing as much as I can personally within the corporation to become more and more ambitious. And then also I'll say something really inspiring that happened recently was a group of employees passionate about sustainability came together and created like a grassroots organization called Corning Sustainability Network. And within like a week of this organization being created, we had like over 400 members, and I think the number is still growing. And so through this network, all these employees worldwide are looking at what they're doing day to day and saying, how can I be more sustainable in my daily work? And also they're coming up with ideas and generating feedback. And this group is sponsored by our Vice President of Sustainability. So they're able to voice their concerns, bring up ideas, and it gets directly noticed by our upper leadership. So that's like a very interesting organization that I'm excited to see grow. And one of my colleagues is the president now. So that's something I would also say it gives me hope for the future.
Yeah, that's great. Any thoughts, comments?
Anybody have any interests?
So Europe went through an industrial era, and so did America. And China is debatably still in its industrial era. Do you believe that like innovation could speed this process up, or like maybe get like, Africa to maybe skip past the industrial era, such that similar to where we are now?
It's a great question.
You want to say anything? Or go one right down the
I
line.
mean, I have an answer for this, so I don't know that it's the right one.
That is a hard one. And can you skip over? That's an interesting question. You may have to go through the growing pains of an industrialization process with all the problems that arise when you do that, especially if you are starting from square one, really. So you may not be able to skip over some of the difficult stages, growing pains. And since, what are the estimates? Like the energy demand in the world is going to increase by over 50% in 20 years. I mean, it's at least that. The percentages are huge. And they're all not coming from places in the US, but all these developing countries, all moving in this direction. So it's going to be happening. And it'd be nice to be able to predict how that trajectory is going to happen.
I mean, I think it depends completely on like what we, and when I mean Europe and the US and research hubs, right, are able to give to them for free. And I don't mean like, hey, you pay us back on the da-da-da-da-da-da, right? I mean, if you look at the models and simulations, right, we've been reducing our emissions as a country. Europe's been doing it longer than we have. We still got a long way to go, obviously, but we're trying, we're moving towards that. Even China and India have set, zero emission goals, and they're thinking about it. They're talking about it, right? They're not even models, again, modeling these outcomes. Those countries and us are not the ones that are going to drive this going forward. It's all these developing countries, right? So if we can go and just like drop renewable energy into their hands for free, sure. But they need energy in order to advance, and they're going to have to build in order to advance. And a big part of my research is really focused on how can we come up with a plan for the tropics, which is going to end up representing over 2/3 of the population in less than 20 years, right? It's hugely developing area. How can we give them a plan of saying like, hey, we did it. It was not so great. We made a lot of mistakes, but like, here are some of the things that we can just give you right off the bat. It's like, don't do this or do this, to kind of help to not make the sea otter mistake, right? Because it's not even that it's a mistake so much like that we blundered into it. It's that it's the easy choice, and it's what makes our economy move forward really rapidly, right? So that's a big part of it, I think.
Echo similar things there, where these nations, like the developing nations now, need options right now, and they need to be affordable options. And there are, depending on where you are, you have resources where it could be really cheap to just build coal-fired power plant. And you can boost your community and your nation and your region of a country a lot. But as Western countries, the best thing that other countries can do and more developed nations can do is the current developing nations have the resource of the knowledge of everything that's been done in the last couple hundred years. And all of that is available. And the more and more society puts out options that are better, or at least close to as good, or are like not expensive, I guess, is just,
Right.
something that's affordable. The more options, the better, right? In some places in the world will take different pathways than we took. It's not like coal-fired power plants are necessarily the critical way to go about doing anything. And when you're developing a region, you have to consider all of those components. And I think as all of the modern nations, there's a lot of pressure to control. And I think that citizens, I think we should be wary about letting ourselves control other people. But I think that the best way we can kind of help is to guide with the knowledge and provide more resources and more information, or just offer straight up technology.
Right.
As nations that have money, we could buy technology and donate it directly.
Sure.
I could offer one real world experience if it helps with regard to China. I was involved in business in China in the 1990s. And it was conspicuous to me that cell phones were new here. But conspicuous to me in China, they were with everybody. I didn't understand why everybody and all the Chinese seemed to have cell phones and we had so few. But what happened there was that, as it was explained to me, is that the Chinese didn't want to go through stringing the wires and having ringing telephones and all these things in their house. They just said, skip that. Take me right to those cell phones. They saw the future. They saw that's where it was going. And that's why it happened that way. In addition to that, the product that I was part of marketing there is automobiles. And our expectation at the auto company was that they were going to want to buy the plain Jane stripped down automobile. The only thing we would do that for them, the only thing we wouldn't sell it with was without a seatbelt. So they had to buy seatbelts, but that was not where they went. They want the airbags. They want anti-lock brakes. They want to jump across all of that, and go on to what's here now, and what they could project in the future. So that was the largest populous country in the world. So not insignificant. Maybe the African countries, this question had to do with Africa. Maybe other countries will see it the same way. The experience I have says it differently.
Well, that's a great point too, to what we were just talking about guiding,
More
right?
options,
Versus controlling.
Yeah.
It may seem completely foreign to us to skip those steps because, oh, no. The way it's always been done, the way we do it is this way. And that's not the way that innovation works, right? And anyone can get caught in that trap. Well, we know the best. We've been doing this for 50 years, 100 years, whatever we've been doing, so it should be a collaboration, because I can tell you, I've met many, many African scientists doing work in the tropics, and they are very uninterested in you coming in and saying, hey, I've done research on all this. This is the way you should do it. They're like, well, what do you think we've been doing? They have universities and research centers as well, and they're working on these things too. So yeah, that guiding and seeing how we can skip forward, and yeah, it's all good.
In that same context, in the energy sector directly, like let's say electric power generation. In the US and in most of Europe, the model has always been centralized power, where we have these giant power plants and we're producing massive amounts of power to a large grid. Like, I mean, you very well will likely see different starting points in different places. As well, why not just have a localized power grid,
Right.
and local generation, which is on a much smaller scale, and you may eventually, as our power plants over the next couple hundred years kind of fall apart, see a transition towards that kind of thing in the US, but it's probably so, I mean, you're battling politics and you're battling money in corporations that have huge lobbying efforts. So it's not necessarily a transition that might ever happen. But in those developing countries, they don't necessarily have to do the model of, we're going to go big and provide our whole country from, with this one network.
Sure.
So.
What about, like, as we move towards like more renewable energy, we're using developing countries rare earth minerals, we're mining, and like those people are mining. What is that going to impact when they get to that and they can't use it?
It might take
You're-
you back.
You're saying like they now need them.
Well, I'm saying like the poor people who are mining those minerals for our iPhones.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Like,
Then when they develop and they run out, is that what you're saying?
yeah, or the fact that we're putting poor people again, like Dr. Selig was saying, we're taking advantage and exploiting the poor in those countries to get to this.
Yeah. I mean, that goes along with the second part of today, right? It's climate solutions and justice, right? Because a lot of the solutions that we have and a lot of the problems that we have right now, we're maybe not thinking about from a justice perspective, right? We're not thinking about those communities, and we need to, right? Abroad where we're taking our resources from, but also, domestically, where we have communities that we're just like, oh, well, we'll save our communities, right? We'll put seawalls around the communities of the wealthy, but everybody else can just they'll figure it out. It's it's a good point.
I think you'll see some maybe not, physical conflicts, but some conflicts, especially on, the economic side, as certain developing nations that have been kind of harvested by other nations over years for their resources. I mean, obviously those places have kind of put money into those areas. But maybe they've kind of gotten a good deal. And those dynamics will definitely change in some regions of the world. We may also see issues like, right now, I don't think the tensions are super high between the US and China, but in the rest of the world. But, they have a lot of resources that a lot of people rely on. And as they start to transition into different technologies as well, they're going to rely on their own resources more and more. And that will mean that they're not going to be as reluctant to give those up to other people without cost. And so nations are going to have to kind of explore their own resources more and more as time goes, or else you're just going to be out of luck in many cases. Yeah.
So yeah, I see what you mean. So like the United Kingdom's had colonies in Africa, and they used their resources for their industry
For a long time, and not.
And we had transatlantic slave trade for ours, and that helped us a lot. So it's like, what resources do they still have? So.
Yeah, I mean, certainly to pick a country, right? I mean, they've got different strengths, they've got different weaknesses resource wise, right? something that comes to mind, especially when we're talking about centralized power for me is, I have some colleagues in Ecuador and they're growing fairly rapidly, and they're tearing down a lot of their forests and putting power plants way out in the forest and then stringing that grid all the way back in. One of their resources is forest, right? So that's kind of a problem, right? So yeah, it just depends on the place, right? And where you are. And some countries are more fortunate in their resources than others, which is why we've had many wars that have been fought over those things, right? I mean, for the last like 50 years, we've been fighting over oil in the Middle East, the US has, right? Because we want it, because we don't want to deal with drilling it here. So yeah, it's certainly, I mean, that's an ongoing environmental issue across the board, not even just energy wise, of course, also, but yeah. How we doing?
Well, we're all out of time. So just as a reminder, there is still the sign up sheet in the back. And there are upcoming panels at 3:35 p.m. The upcycling fair, vendor booths in the CC, and a tour of the sustainability house meeting at McGraw and the post office fountain at 2:25. But thank you guys for coming and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.